What's up, folks? This is Gongjo, and today I'm bringing you a Outriders review. And I haven't, produced a review for my channel in quite some time, so it's not something I'm kind of in the habit of doing lately. But it is something that I kind of want to kind of speak about games in a way that is fun for me. So obviously I'm playing Apex Legends a lot, but I'm also playing lots of other games. So every now and again I want to talk about things like Outriders and things like, whatever I'm playing at that particular time. So lately I've been getting a lot of people asking me kind of, how is Outriders? Like, is that game any fun? And that's what this video is for. I'm kind of here to show you a little bit of the game, talk about how it's kind of similar or different to games like Destiny and Borderlands, and kind of give you my kind of opinion on it. So for those of you who aren't aware what Outriders is, this is a loot shooter developed by People Can Fly. It's very much a third-person action game in the vein of something like Gears of War, with these kind of Diablo or Destiny style like RPG loot shooter elements overlaid onto them. Now this game is very different from both of those two games in various ways that I'll get into, but it's in that kind of ilk. It's that kind of idea of having this perpetual progression of your character as you play through. Like, you're constantly getting new abilities, you're constantly getting new equipment, you're constantly adapting your playstyle and making decisions as you go through the game about how you want to play the game. And Outriders really does a lot right, and it does a little bit wrong as well. And I'm going to kind of focus on more of what it gets right early on, and then talk about kind of, there's this big thing that I think gets in the way of what Outriders is that I want to talk about close to the end of this video. Let's really start by talking about the things that I think Outriders gets right, and I think one of the biggest things this game gets right in comparison to other shooters and other loot shooters is the kind of RPG side of things. The kind of decision making, the skill trees, the loot, mostly. There's some issues with the loot, but mostly it does all of this pretty well. And it doesn't necessarily compare well when you put it against games like Diablo, which kind of have this longer heritage of providing these really in-depth RPG experiences to kind of like these different ways to customize your character and define how you play the game. But when you compare it to games like Destiny and Borderlands and things like that, I think that's where Outriders really does compare very well in this regard. And that's because Outriders really gives you so many choices and so much control of how you want to kind of play the game and how you want to build your character. And what I mean by that is, for instance, the game's skill tree just has so many different options, and you're never really locked into a particular path. You have the flexibility to kind of go partially down one route, then flip to the other, and then flip to another. And all of these skills they really do change how you can play the game. And in a way that you don't really get in something like Destiny. Because in a game like Destiny, you've got your abilities, and these will be a melee ability, a grenade ability, and then your super ability. But the grenades are literally just different types of grenades. Like, you get different types of grenades in Halo. You get different types of grenades in Call of Duty. They're not really abilities that make the game interesting from an RPG perspective. And then you don't get a lot of control or interactions between your skills and equipment with how you customize those abilities. So it very much feels like, in a game like Destiny, Bungie have designed this class to play this way, and for the most part, you're going to play the class that Bungie have designed, right? But in Outriders, it very much feels like you're customizing how you use these abilities, and you're making decisions in your skill tree relative to how they interact with your abilities. So just as an example, I might take the kind of flame wave ability. I forget the exact names of the skills in the game. I might take this fire eruption or flame wave ability that goes in a straight line towards the enemies and burns everything in its path. But then I also have the option to kind of take 4 bits of armor and equip mods that interact with that ability. So they might give me 3 uses of that skill. They might give me an extended range on that skill. They might burn enemies for longer. And I can really kind of funnel my class down into that particular playstyle if that's what I want. And given that there are like a diverse number of skills, I think there's 8 skills for each character, and you can pick 3 to use at any one time, you can really craft this kind of unique playstyle based on your individual choices. One thing I will say, there's a bit of a caveat in Outriders, it does feel that sometimes that some of these are... Because the issue with this kind of game is if all the choices aren't equally effective, then the other choices are kind of false choices, right? So you can give someone this like massive pool of options available, but if then there's one clearly viable route, then it's not as if those other choices really exist at all, right? And I'm not saying that's true in Outriders in general, but in some instances it does feel a little bit like that to me, based on my experience with the game. And it might not be true, but it's just based on kind of my experience with the game, that I've found, in particular, the skills that kind of modify your projectile, so like volcanic rounds, like blighted rounds. So these skills enhance your weapon abilities. So they don't just kind of use an ability that's independent of what weapon you're using. They enhance your weapon, right? So the thing with that is, given that it's a loot shooter, you're getting all of these different guns and things like that, and you're getting all of this scaling off your weapons. If you then have an ability that links in with that, it tends to be a really strong and obvious path to doing an insane amount of damage just by focusing on that particular skill set. And I think maybe that's a little bit disappointing, just because it kind of makes the game a bit more narrow in terms of build diversity. Even though you have a lot of choices present, the number of options you have are perhaps a little bit narrower than it first seems. I mean, by all means, you can probably beat everything in the game with the worst build in the game, realistically, just because, you know, if you're a good enough player, then it's probably possible to kind of outskill everything. At times, Outriders does feel like a game where your kind of DPS really does matter, though. Like, enemies can get quite tanky, they can be quite difficult to kill if you're not kind of building the right way. So there is two sides to that. Like, maybe it would be quite difficult if you're kind of making all of the wrong decisions at every stage. Still, that is one of the game's biggest strengths. Like, compared to something like Destiny, it really does feel like you have a lot of control in Outriders. You have a lot of control, and that means that when you're kind of progressing through the game and feeling more and more powerful, it's feeling like it's a reward for your decision making, right? Like, it's feeling like, wow, everything's coming together, all my planning is kind of coming together, and that's a really satisfying feeling that you get from games like Diablo that you do not get from games like Destiny, at least in my experience of those games. That's kind of like the RPG stuff that I really like in Outriders. The other big area I want to talk about, I guess, is the kind of content in the game. Obviously, this is a sci-fi shooter, and with that comes this kind of like alien planet exploration sort of thing. It's not like Destiny where you're hopping between different planets, but this game is very aesthetically diverse as you hop between snow, desert, jungle, etc. on a singular planet. It's in the vein of something like, you know, Borderlands 2, where you're hopping between region to region on an individual planet, doing side quests and doing pursuing the main quest across each of these regions. So the thing about Outriders is it's very much segmented into these kind of individual, relatively self-contained compartments, which are similar to, you know, like a planet in Destiny, similar to like a region in Destiny. These areas they'll contain like 4 missions and some optional side quests, and then you'll have to travel through a loading screen to get to another area, which will have a distinct art style. It'll look a little bit different, it might have some different enemies. So all of these areas kind of have their own kind of theme, they have their own enemies. Obviously some enemies are reused between area and area, but they generally introduce something new at each stage. The big difference in terms of gameplay throughout the game is whether you're fighting kind of wildlife or people with guns. And they're very distinctive styles of play, because obviously this is a kind of Gears of War style cover shooter, but cover becomes pretty much completely irrelevant when you've got wildlife in the fray, because all they want to do is run at you, really. I mean, there's very occasional enemies that will shoot projectiles at you, like maybe one of them shoots poison at you from a distance, but 90% of the enemies in that space really just want to get in your face and kill you. So it suddenly stops being a cover shooter and starts being this kind of more mobile third-person action game, which is really cool. I think that you have this kind of 2 distinct sets of playstyles. I don't think you have quite a large distinction in other games like Destiny, just because even if you're fighting a faction like the Hive in Destiny, they still have guns. They still, like, the Acolytes and the Knights, they all have guns. They're all shooting at you. There's some of them that are rushing you, and they're kind of encouraging you to move, but there's a lot of similarity between each of the factions there. Whereas in Outriders, I would say that the 2 kind of key factions, I mean, technically there are more than 2 factions in this game, but it tends to be people with guns or people without guns. You know what I mean? Like, there are 2 distinct groups of enemy kind of types that you'll encounter, and those are the 2 kind of distinct groups that actually change how you play the game. Like within the kind of humanoid enemies, there are sub-factions that might bring a different kind of AI boss type enemy with them, but for the most part they're going to be shooting you with guns, or they're going to be like shooting you with guns but they look a bit different. But those two distinct groups, wildlife and enemies with guns, they really do change how you play the game. They change how you might want to build your character, they change how you move in combat, and I think that is a really cool feature of the game, and it helps keep the gameplay quite diverse as you go from one mission to the next. Narratively, I would say the game is quite weak, to be truthful with you. If you want a really cool sci-fi story, then probably don't play Outriders, probably read a book or watch a TV show or something, because this is just not it. And I don't think Destiny's story is amazing or anything like that. I mean, I think some of the lore is cool, but I think in general, Destiny lets players down in terms of providing a narrative as well. But Outriders in particular, it does provide a narrative, and I think the developers are quite proud of it, but the writing is just, it's pretty horrendous, to be truthful with you. It's very cringy, very difficult to sit through. The movements of the narrative are interesting at times. It's interesting to see what will happen next, in the same way it's interesting to kind of turn a comic book page and see what's on the next page, because of how like wacky things can be and how things can twist in kind of unpredictable ways. And that isn't always a good thing, but if you're just playing it for the kind of amusement park factor of it, you know, just to see like, oh wow, that's a weird thing that happened next, or wow, that's a cool spectacle, or wow, that's a cool kind of vista, then I think Outriders is appreciable from that element. But if you're looking for a really in-depth narrative that will make you want to kind of think a little bit, then it's definitely not this game, and you should probably just play something else. But if you're looking for a really in-depth cooperative loot shooter, then I think Outriders is a really good offering, because of the kind of combination of depth with character building and also the really compelling gameplay loops and things like that. The gameplay as itself, as a third-person shooter, is fun. The game feels satisfying. It looks spectacular in general. I would say it looks very good. I'm playing on the PlayStation 5. I have also tried the game on the PlayStation 4, and it does not look so good, and it does not play so well, in my opinion. Like on the PlayStation 4, it felt there was a bit more input lag, and in general, the game looked quite a bit kind of muddier, I would say. It looked a bit dull, didn't look like the texture resolutions were there, didn't look like the frame rate was there all the time. It was enjoyable for the person I played it with. They didn't mind, but going from the PS5 version to the PS4 version, I would find very difficult. So your mileage is really going to vary there, but it doesn't look anywhere near as good on a PS4 as you would expect, really. The other kind of big question that people have for this type of game, and this kind of relates to the kind of marketing buzz, and one of the bigger issues with the game, I guess, too. So this is the end game, right? This is what everyone kind of talks about when they talk about these loot shooters. It's like, when you beat the campaign, what do you do? How do you play this game perpetually? And the answer to that really is that I don't think you can play it forever. I really don't think you can get an endless amount of content from Outriders in the same way that you might for something like Destiny. But I do think there's a compelling endgame loop that will keep you there for maybe another 30 or so hours. So once you beat the campaign in the game, once you kind of beat the big bad or whatever in this narrative, you're presented with this scenario where you have these extra 15 missions where you can collect resources. And you can do these missions on one of 15 different challenge tiers, and gradually as you complete them, you're given the opportunity to kind of progress further into the challenge tiers. So this enables you to get better and better loot, but obviously the missions get progressively more difficult as well. So essentially it's just a system of kind of pushing you further and further into the loot pool to make your character stronger, while equally kind of upping the stakes as you go. And the same is true for the main campaign too. You have this world tier system in the game, which is similar to kind of the difficulty tiers in Diablo, where if you increase the world tier, it's going to increase the enemy levels and drops and things like that, but it's also going to make the game harder. So you have this constant kind of fight between your character and your build and how strong they are, and kind of wanting to push the difficulty further. And essentially with these kind of extra 15 missions, that continues into the post-game. I don't know how much people really are going to get out of these 15 missions, to be truthful though. Well, I've completed maybe 7 of them or something along those lines, and I've replayed a couple of the ones that I've played before, and outside the fact that you're getting stronger and you're getting more efficient at killing the enemies, the missions are the same, right? And they're not especially lengthy. They kind of have three, you can kind of break them down into three encounters where you fight enemies. So you kind of get the feel of what each mission entails really quite quickly. It's not like something like, Payday 2, where they've designed these like complicated heists which are designed to be replayed in different ways. The missions in Outriders very much are the same each time. Aside the kind of build that you're bringing to the table for each mission, there's not that much diversity. So I think what people are going to get out of this game is going to be kind of getting their build to that peak and kind of completing these missions on the highest difficulty. And that might take, it might take 30 hours to beat the main campaign, 20 to 30 hours to beat the main campaign, and then another 30 hours in this kind of post-game loop to kind of reach the pinnacle for their character. And I think that's where Outriders sets itself apart. This is a game that you can beat. You can get to this kind of peak efficacy with your character. You can kind of sit there and say, this is probably good enough. This is as good as my character's going to get. And you can kind of take enjoyment from how strong you get in the game and all the loot you've acquired and things like that. But realistically, there is a kind of final point here where you probably are going to get to the point where, I've done everything. I can't get stronger. There is no kind of perpetual way to play this game. Now, it's not necessarily a bad thing if you think about it. If you think about it in terms of like live service games like Destiny, where they're designed to be played forever, essentially, and keep people going back day to day, then yeah, this game doesn't fit that model, but you can easily get 60 hours out of this game with a single character before that character really peaks. And it really fits in with kind of Borderlands style of kind of game design, much more so than it does with a game like Destiny. Borderlands 2 is a game where you can play it for like 50 plus hours with a certain character, and you can max that character out, get all the guns you want for their build, and you can kind of say, this experience has really peaked for me at this point. I can play for the sheer enjoyment of it at this stage, but at this point there's not much for me to see or do. So that's definitely something to take in consideration when you buy this game. I would say it's not necessarily a bad or good thing, but it's a game that's designed to be beaten and put down. And it's a game that you could easily get 200 hours out of if you were to kind of take that experience to that level with each of the 4 classes in the game. But at the same time, it's also a game that you could just play for 20, 30 hours with a group of friends, beat the main campaign, and then walk away and have, you had a good time with that, in the same way that people do with Gears of War and things like that. So it doesn't really cater to that long-term experience, but I think it is a good game for the time that it does offer you, and it doesn't waste your time during that, which is pretty cool, because a lot of these live service games, they really do waste your time. They really get you to do the same mission like 40 times in a row. If you're something like Destiny, it's just like, do this strike a million times. And there's a little bit of that in Outriders too, I guess, with the post-game missions, but nowhere near as much as there is in some other games that want you to just play forever doing your daily missions to keep you hooked on that like loot distribution system. So that's kind of what Outriders is really now, and I think there's a lot of compelling reasons to want to get into Outriders, and for me, this is one of the most exciting kind of loot shooters that I played recently at all. I mean, the last big one I really, really liked outside of playing Destiny was maybe Borderlands 2. That was the last one I really got into. I did enjoy Borderlands 3 as well, but it's not as good. And then we have things like The Division and Destiny, where I have sunk a lot of time into those games, in particular Destiny, but I've never really felt satisfied by the end of it. It always comes down to me kind of thinking, wow, I can't believe I'm doing this every day. This is really, really boring. And then moving on, I'm not saying that Destiny is a boring game. I mean, if you enjoy it day to day, then, that's great. But for me, just the repetition in those games and the kind of ask for you to play them endlessly is just something I can't necessarily do, basically. But I think Outriders, it's in a good spot when compared to games like Diablo and Borderlands as kind of like games that you play to complete and put down and have a good time with for, 30 to 200 hours. So that's kind of that perspective on the game. I did want to talk about one more thing, and that is this game's big caveat. And this might not be a caveat to you necessarily. It probably will affect you at the moment in some way, but it won't necessarily put you off the game, because I know a lot of people do play games like this. But this is the fact that this game is online only. And at the moment, during its launch, this has been, I don't want to say a disaster, but it's not been good, right? Like, this is a game that is purely cooperative. Like, there's no competitive elements in the game. There's no reason you would necessarily really be afraid of someone cheating or anything like that. So there's no reason necessarily for this game to be online only. And I'm sure that if you'd speak to the developers, they'd say it needed to be online only, absolutely had to be online only, because they have some like complicated cloud-based distribution system for the loot or anything like that. But that is nonsense, because this game isn't doing anything that's like complicated or sophisticated enough to require that. You have games like Borderlands, which are doing, you know, things that are equally complex as Outriders, and I would argue probably a bit more in terms of like the number of enemies on the screen and the number of kind of like number of variables that Borderlands is rolling at any one time tend to be a little bit heftier. And that game is running everything locally and with probably a little bit better performance than Outriders, to be truthful with you. So it really begs the question why this game is online only. And the only thing I can really think of is it's Square Enix and People Can Fly seeking to protect their intellectual property. And particularly with the PC version of the game, it enables them to kind of protect against piracy in some way, because if they have forced online and you have to connect to servers, then you can always detect if someone's stolen the game. So if you don't mind games that are online only, then that's fine. But during this launch window, there's been so many server issues that it's clear that the fact that it's online only is a problem for the player experience. Like, it's getting in the way of people being able to experience the game in the way that they, well, in any way, really. Some of the time you can't even log into the servers because it's online only. And if it was like a Borderlands 3 style game, it wouldn't matter if it was online only. I could still play by myself, and I wouldn't have to authenticate with the server every single time I try and log in. And this isn't like a comfortable process. Like, it takes a long time to log into Outriders. It takes about 30 seconds, right? But if you're disconnecting every now and again, it's booting you out of the mission you're on because you've disconnected from the internet. It's just annoying. And obviously some of this is teething issues, right? Some of this is just the game developer being overwhelmed with consumers picking up this game. The game was free on Xbox Game Pass, so obviously they're going to have maybe 10 million extra players or something crazy like that than they would have otherwise had in the demo and things like that, because everyone on Game Pass is going to be downloading this game. It's a game that at its kind of release has shipped on Game Pass, so I imagine it's super popular on Game Pass, so that's really going to push the numbers on their servers. However, it does highlight all of the issues that come with having this game as an online only game. Like, anytime my personal network drops, even when the servers become stable, anytime my personal network drops, I lose access to Outriders. I can't play it. Anytime, I have a flicker in my internet connection, it's going to disconnect me from the servers and kick me out of the mission I'm doing. Anytime, maybe it's 6 years down the road and they turn the servers offline for Outriders, I can't revisit my character. I can't revisit the build I created, and that's not true in games like Borderlands. That's not true in, one reason why I never got into games like The Crew, for instance. That's kind of a racing RPG style game, where there's this idea that you kind of collect all these different cars and build this garage of cars up, was because in those kind of games, I really like to keep that collection forever. And in something like Forza Horizon 4, I can collect all the cars in the game, and I can revisit the game in 5 years' time, and I can look at that impressive collection of cars. But in The Crew, as soon as the servers are offline, whatever time I've sunk into that game, it feels, it's not wasted, obviously, because I get the experience of playing the game, and that in itself can be inherently enjoyable. But it does feel a shame to lose it all. I really do think that people wouldn't play games like Pokemon if they really thought that, they didn't have that ownership and connection to their Pokemon. And I think that that affects games like Outriders to a lesser extent, but it does still affect the experience, at least for a player like me. So with the server issues and the fact that it's online only, that really does put a little bit of a damper on the experience. Like, this is definitely something that people can overlook. If you're a Destiny player, you play an online only game all the time anyway. If you're a Division player, same thing. And there are many other games that are online only that people have learned to kind of live with and tolerate, but especially when you're having all these server issues, it just kind of exemplifies why this isn't necessarily the best design choice. And there's other games like Destiny, they have reasons to be online only. They have things like PvP, which would be like, Destiny PvP is messed up anyway, but Destiny's PvP would be 10 times more messed up if it wasn't an online game, because you'd have people cheating so easily in PvP if it wasn't an online only game. You'd have people making all sorts of like crazy cheats for their armor and things like that and taking them into PvP. But this game doesn't have that. It doesn't have that excuse to protect players, so it really doesn't feel like it has any business being an online only game. It just harms the player experience. But with that said, if you can, tolerate this online only side of things, and I think Outriders is a really good loot shooter. I'd really recommend it. It's something you can have a lot of fun with. For me, it's been a really good distraction from Apex Legends. The core gameplay loop is really enjoyable. I think I was really surprised by how in-depth the RPG systems were. I've been playing as I played as 2 characters. I played as the Pyromancer and the Trickster, but I've really got the Pyromancer as kind of the end game state in the game. And that has been really fun. It's been really fun kind of controlling my build and pushing it in a direction that makes me feel really powerful, and it feels like that power is tied to the decisions I've made with my guns and with my skill trees and things like that. So definitely, if you're looking for a loot shooter, check Outriders out. It's worth a go. Maybe give it a week or 2 to see if the server stabilizes. I would personally, it's not fun disconnecting. It's not fun not being able to access the servers. But in general, this definitely seems to be one to look out for, and hopefully this is one that gets kind of expansions and sequels as well, because that's the kind of model they're going for here. They're looking to release day 1 complete games. That means the kind of successor to Outriders will be either a huge expansion or, Outriders 2. And I definitely hope this kind of spawns a series of games from this studio, because although this is a really good initial step, I think there's a lot of room for improvement here too. Now, hopefully you enjoyed my review. Please remember to like, comment, and subscribe, or any of those things. Maybe even click the notification bell, whatever. I don't really understand how YouTube works, so just do whatever you feel like. Thanks. This has been Gungjo. Peace out.